Donald Trump is newly gagged, ordered yesterday by the New York judge presiding over his civil fraud case, not to speak about any clerks or staff members of the court. However, that limited gag order has not stopped the former president from escalating his attacks, this time on New York Attorney General Letitia James and Judge Arthur Engoron himself. Today, on day 3 of this trial, Trump called the Attorney General a racist and a dirty cop, while also using a racially loaded epithet against her. Inside the courtroom, Trump was reportedly more vocal than he had been on previous days. He expressed his frustrations about not having a jury trial, something he potentially could have had if his lawyers requested one. They did not. Halfway through the day, the former president seemed to have had enough, and during the lunch break, he stormed out to complain to reporters.
I'm here, stuck here, and I can't campaign. I'd rather be right now in Iowa. I'd rather be in New Hampshire or South Carolina or Ohio or a lot of other places, but I'm stuck here because I have a corrupt attorney general. They made up a fake case. They're fraudulent people. And the judge already knows what he's going to do. He's a Democrat judge.
I'm stuck here. I'd rather be in Iowa. That's what Trump said before he left on his private jet for Florida. So not stuck, also not in Iowa. Shortly after he departed, Attorney General Letitia James had this to say.
Mr. Trump's comments were offensive. They were baseless. They were void of any facts and or any evidence. What they were comments that unfortunately fomented violence, and comments that I would describe as race baiting. I will not be bullied. And so Mr. Trump is no longer here. The Donald Trump show is over. This was nothing more than a political stunt.
With me tonight, Mary McCord and Andrew Weissman. Andrew, how much further can Trump go here? In addition to those comments, he called Judge Engoron someone who is run by the Democrats. He already knows what he's going to do. The whole system is corrupt. Engoron came out of the clubhouse. I mean, at what point is there a gag order extended to the judge?
Well, it's interesting because the gag order that was issued yesterday was narrow. It was about the judge's staff, and that part seemed to work. And so Lawrence O'Donnell talked about this, which is thinking of him as sort of the cowardly lion, which is a bully being called out. You know, Donald Trump does not want to go to jail, and these judges, both in the civil case and in 4 criminal cases, have the power if he continues doing this. In fact, on October 16th, the D.C. federal judge is having a hearing on this very issue. So if he continues down this road, that'll be for Judge Chutkan to figure out, should there be additional restrictions. And I think the line, at least for me, is looking to language that is sort of calling for, whether intentional or not, violence. That's really the real issue. That's why the reason that the judge was so concerned about the comments about his staff. I do think one thing that's very interesting is this week we saw both the Attorney General of the United States and now Letitia James speaking out. And we've talked a lot about this, you know, the disparity, because most of the times prosecutors don't speak. They speak only in court. I thought it was very interesting, and I actually think commendable for them to be picking their moments to talk about not the guilt of the defendant, not to cross the line and to talk about why he's so guilty, but rather to sort of show that they're not really going to put up with this, and they're going to uphold the integrity of the process and the institution. I thought it was really interesting and a good sign that they're not sticking to the sort of older model, which is you don't say anything at all.
Well, I mean, Jack Smith has not said anything. He's made very clear that the DOJ would like to have some kind of limited speech order imposed on former President Trump, which is the case that you mentioned in that response there, Andrew, the Judge Chutkan's case. My question is, to some degree, the limited gag order prevented Trump from saying anything disparaging about the clerk. It certainly didn't prevent him from saying anything disparaging about the Attorney General or the judge in this case. It's like whack-a-mole. And one would assume that gag order has to be expanded to cover more people involved in this case. But I guess the question I have for you, Mary, is, are any of these judges actually prepared to mete out the punishment that comes with a violation?
Well, so there's a couple of different types of punishment. Like, I think we'll see judges, and particularly when Judge Chutkan has her hearing on October 16th, she will be weighing Mr. Trump's First Amendment rights, particularly as someone who is running for office, against the threat that he poses to those people who he is denigrating, who he is attacking, and knowing, because we all know this, and this is replete in Jack Smith's motion and his reply, that there is this call and response effect. Donald Trump says something disparaging, somebody issues a threat toward that person. He says something disparaging, somebody takes a gun and tries to attack the FBI, right? So these judges know that. So I think they're going to try to thread the needle here with orders that are narrow enough to not tread on his First Amendment rights to be a candidate, but restrict his speech that has the potential for inciting violence. And then in terms of what they will do, in the criminal cases, obviously, these are conditions of his bail, his pretrial release. I don't think they would immediately jail him, but they might do other incremental steps. One of the things Andrew and I have talked about before is potentially saying you have to have your social media posts cleared by your attorneys or run past your attorneys. The judge in the civil case...
What about his mouth? How do you do that?
That's what just it, because, this statement out on the courthouse, hallway would not be something that could get pre-cleared. So then the question becomes, what else? And I will note in a civil case, even though that's not a case that involves a condition of your pretrial release, if a judge issues an order and you violate, that's contempt, and you can be held criminally or civilly liable for contempt of court. That could be financial penalties, and that could also be jailing. So jail is an option, whether it's civil or criminal. It's just, I do think the judges will be reluctant to take that option unless he keeps just violating. And I think each time he's going to try to go right up that line, and then sometimes, he may go right over it.
Do you think Judge Chutkan is looking at what Judge Engoron is doing up in New York and saying, okay, when I figure out what kind of speech I'm limiting, I got to keep in mind what's been happening there and perhaps have a sort of more aggressive initial ruling on this because of the precedent that's set in New York?
I think that she is going to be thinking about every statement that he has made in writing or orally from the moment that he has been under indictment. And I think she will also be looking at whether he complied with an order from the judge here. And I think in some ways, if he is complying with this order, that's sort of good for him, right? Mm-hmm. In that it means that he can actually tailor his conduct to an order, and she would be much less likely, I think, to jail him immediately and would be thinking about a more narrowly tailored order. But the main issue is this potential for violence, because there's that has to be the thing that is weighing, I think, should be on all of these judges, is that you don't want to be doing this after the fact.
Yes, absolutely. And we know what the track record here is. Mary McCord and Andrew Weissmann, two of my favorite brilliant minds to listen to, both in podcast form and in person.